Hello, everyone, and welcome to this second installment of Leather and Spice. Going to wait for some people to join in. Hello, everyone. I hope you all are having a great day. It's very warm here, so hence the outfit. Okay, so today our guest is Norman Brannon. I see that he has joined our little live, and yeah, so he is going to join me as I do some cooking in my kitchen, and we're gonna have a nice little conversation once he's all set up. Technology. Hey,
Hey,
can, can you hear me?
I can.
Do the microphones work? Okay, great.
Yeah, I just had to get some headphones in case I didn't want to echo.
Yes, I think it's working well, so this is great. Thank you for joining me today. Um,
Thank you.
and so let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to do while we have our conversation. I picked out a recipe. Um, I don't know if this recipe resonates at all with you, but let me
Did, did you
grab
go
it.
vegetarian?
It is vegetarian. It is
All right.
vegetarian. Um, so it's coming out of this book that focuses on Swedish coffee desserts called fika. And today we're going to be making some coconut peaks.
Okay.
And there are five ingredients. It's butter, eggs, sugar, coconut, and salt. So very
Okay, that sounds
basic.
super easy.
Um, and so that's what I'm going to be making while we chat.
All
I
right.
have not prepared anything at all, so it's gonna, be from total scratch, and we'll go from there.
That's perfect. Yeah, I mean
Awesome.
the total scratch works conversationally too.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I feel like that's where things, go.
Yeah.
So tell me about what's been going on with you this past week. I feel like you've had kind of a big week, and you had a
Yeah,
birthday a
I
few days
did
ago, right?
on Thursday, and it was yeah, it's been an amazing birthday week. I think I always dreaded uh, age.
Mm,
And I think that that's like a concern that's both like a queer concern and like a punk concern. So like coming from sort of both places, I think I had a lot of anxiety, uh, when I was younger about what does it mean to get older. And I think like queer
okay.
guys specifically, queer men, we sometimes, or at least when I was growing up, we used to think that you lost your desirability and your sort of edginess and all these things based on how old you were.
Yes.
I think that's changed. I feel like that's changed. I feel
I
like younger gay men now are very interested in me all of a sudden.
I mean, okay, but I feel like there's a difference here because I mean like I personally was never really that interested in guys my age. Like even when
Mm,
I was like 18, I was hooking up with guys who were like 50 and 60 and
right.
so forth. And I was never interested in guys my age because I'm like, what do you have to offer? And it was so it may be that now you are seeing a different segment of the gay spectrum that maybe you didn't see when you were that age.
Yes, but I would also proffer a an explanation for why you were maybe attracted to older men when you were younger, and I think that's because, uh, especially men of our age and sort of like we're in our generations and stuff, uh, we were really emotionally stunted, I think, as young queers.
Yes, yes.
And
Hello.
so and so the generation before us, I think, were even more emotionally stunted.
Yeah, yeah,
And so
I can see that.
someone who was 50 or 60 when you were 18, 19, or 20, honestly, you guys were probably meeting at a similar emotional age.
I think, I mean, yeah, I think that's one way to say it. Yes, I think that that's a fair assessment. Yes.
I mean, again, I think the gaps are sort of like getting smaller now, like as kids are coming out much sooner and sort of they're able to like live their, authentic selves, as they say,
Yeah.
much sooner. But like, I mean, I thought I came out late. I came out when I was 23,
Mm.
and I think to some kids now that is late. It's like, oh man, you blew it.
And do you mind sharing what year was that?
So 23 would have been 97,
Okay.
1997. Yeah. And I think,
I, I
the
can't.
other thing is that coming out was sort of like, I was trying to explain this to somebody the other day. I was saying like, yeah, I guess I call that when I came out, but there was never I never sat anyone down and said, I have to
Right.
tell you something.
Well, but also like you you keep coming out all your life. Like,
Right.
like that might have been a first instance where you came out, whether to yourself or to someone, but then it's something that you have to repeat anytime you meet someone new or you're in a new environment. It's kind of this thing that we keep kind of having to approach.
Absolutely. And I think that was so when I described coming out, at least that first time in 1997, all that meant for me was that everything that I had been policing for my entire life, I was no longer policing. So
Mm,
I was no longer policing my speech. I was no longer policing my movement. I was no longer policing the way that I discussed the things that I liked, my public taste, let's say. I wasn't policing how I dressed. There was none of that was there anymore. And once you stop all of that policing, you're closer to now who you really are. And people just see
yes,
that.
yes,
And when people see
yes.
that, it's pretty clear that I'm gay. I don't need to say it.
Yes, yes. When you think back to 1997, because I don't know if you watched like there's a Netflix documentary about Woodstock,
Yeah,
Woodstock 99.
yeah.
And like I do have some nostalgia about the 90s, but I find the 90s in retrospect to be so heterocentric. Like, of course, everything's always heterocentric, but there was this like culture of just like you you look at the Woodstock documentary and it just goes up in flames, and then it's like, yeah, of course Trump became president because these people voted for him. Like, what is the surprise? Like, the 90s sure had great music, but there was a lot of like violence in the air.
Well, there was. It was definitely, it was a weird. I do think that the 2000s and definitely Trump is sort of like it's sort of the revenge for the 90s because in a lot of ways the 90s was still had all the trappings of the 80s. It was like I still felt unsafe to come out,
Hmm.
right? And I was in an alternative scene of like mostly sexless people, honestly. I don't think anyone would have cared. um, Actually, I laugh and I say that, but then a good friend of mine who was in, so like I was in a band called Texas is the Reason. And
Yeah.
sort of like our brother band was or this band called the Promise Ring. We put out a split 7-inch with them. We toured with them. We were like very tight. And the guitar player for Promise Ring was also gay. And
Mm.
so we came out at around the same time. And it's actually funny because we moved in together as roommates and had not come out to each other. And
Oh.
it was literally like one night after we had moved in, we were walking to a show in Chicago. This was in Chicago. We were going to a club called the Empty Bottle, and we were talking about something or other completely unrelated. And then out of nowhere, I just said to Jason, "You're gay, right?" And he was like, "Yeah, you too, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay, cool." but but he came out, when his band was sort of peaking in the
Okay.
public eye, and it was in an interview in Spin. And after that happened, the message board that was attached to his record label just blew up with the most homophobic shit I've ever.
Mm.
I mean, it was crazy, and it's sort of like obviously I didn't want to see it, but it also sort of justified my thought process when I was like, I can't come out
Mm.
because I was like, oh my God, these people are all turning against him. They're all turning, and it was a
Yes.
cesspool of
Yes.
homophobia. And this was indie rock, punk.
Yes. Yes.
So what to speak of Woodstock 99?
Right. Right.
So yeah, so that was,
Yeah.
that was a thing. And I think quitting music for even just a few years was a way of just resetting and being able to get to that place where I could just be me and not have to worry about a career or a look or whatever the fuck.
Mm. Would you ever want to go back to the 90s?
No.
Are you one of those people that are like the 90s are the best?
No.
Uh,
I don't think anything that's happened is the best. I'm very, it's funny because I think people sometimes think of me in nostalgic ways, but I really
mm,
don't. Like one of the reasons why Texas is the Reason doesn't get back together as much as everybody would like us to is because of me. Like I'm just like, I'm
mm,
cool leaving it where it is. I feel like we
yeah.
did everything.
I think that's like a healthy position to be in where you can just be like, you know what, like we did what we needed to do, and I'm in a different space in my life where maybe like this doesn't make necessarily that much sense.
Yeah,
Um,
and you
yeah.
want it to be as real as it's ever going to be, and I think that that's something that's very true to me. Like I really
Mm,
feel a obligation, I guess, to do things when they feel real.
yes. Yes. So yeah, I think that's a great way to start this out. So let me tell you a little bit about what I was doing this morning. Because
Okay.
I was thinking about you this morning. I was like, what are we going to talk about? And
Okay.
so naturally, I pulled up your astrology chart because you were so kind
Uh-oh.
to give me your birth information. And
Oh God. Okay.
And okay, so here's like a little fun fact about us. So like what I'm able to do is I can like overlay our two charts like on top of each other.
Okay.
And okay, like this may not sound that special to you, but I thought that this was like kind of cool. Um, so we both have water signs, right? Like my sun is in Pisces and your sun is in Cancer. But the position of our sun, like your sun and my sun, is exactly 120 degrees, which like in astrology is called a trine. And it's kind of this uh, representation that represents basically like easy flow of energy. We're in the same sign, but the fact that it's like exactly like to the minute 120 degrees, um, like it really is suggesting that we are able to communicate well, that we're able to understand each other on like many different levels. And I was like, oh, that's a nice little thing to kind of meditate on. So, um,
I mean, I do feel that. I do feel like we have a little bit of yin and yang, but
yes,
they're very complementary. And I
yes,
almost feel like we have the type of sort of relationship to like challenge each other in interesting ways and also put each other in check if need be.
I think so. Yes. Although I think that you put me more in check than the other way because you like
Well,
to
you're
put
a
me
little
down, you know.
wild.
But
You're a little
yes,
wild.
which is funny because I find that I've spent so much of my life like very controlled
Mm.
and very like tight that now in my adult years I'm like no, fuck it. Like I'm gonna be a little bit more wild because I had to be so constrained and so controlled for so long. So
But
they're
okay,
like,
so talk about that for a second because I feel like, and maybe I'm a little crazy, but I do feel like a lot of leather mind is also sort of a mind that factors in power and control, right?
yes,
Like these things sort of like are in the psyche somewhere, and for everyone it's different, and how they're expressed is different, and how they're internalized is different. But clearly, like I know that I've been called a control freak my entire life, and I know
mm-hmm.
where that comes from. I know that even when I was a young kid, like I used to do this thing where I would redesign my bedroom like every other week
Oh my God,
because
I used to do
it
the same thing.
because it gave me a sense of control in a life where I
Yes,
felt like I had none.
yes,
And
yes,
so control was very important to me, and it's in my psyche. It's not something that I can just, I try to express it in healthy ways, but it can be raw sometimes too.
yes, yes. And I don't know whether that control, how do I say this? Like what came first? That need for control or the environmental situations in which I was raised, in which I didn't feel like I had control and therefore I yearned for
I mean,
control. Do you know what I
I
mean?
honestly think that's where it comes from.
It's probably that. I mean, like,
I mean, because it
yeah,
really like, when you talk about sort of like leather scenes and sort of like endorphins and all those things. Honestly, like redoing my bedroom every other week gave me those endorphins. They're the
yes.
same. I would sit there just with this feeling of like, yeah. It's a weird thing, but I mean, I think that that's sort of the connection for me. Like, whenever you and I have ever talked about leather, like I'm always talking about the psychological piece of it
Yes.
that is, you know, first and foremost to me, psychological or my psychology is sort of like a pressing concern. It sort of always has been for me. As soon as I was able to realize that therapy was a place to go, I was like, "Ooh, I want that. Let's talk about psychology."
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think that that's like a really important point. And the idea that was popping in my head as you were speaking was about how as children, our room, at least for me, was my world. And so be able to rearrange my room made me feel like I had control of the world in a way. I mean, like my world was so
hmm
small. Um, that yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly in a lot of leather folk that I meet this um, need to play around with control. And for me, like I tend to be exercising more of like the dom side, but when I do find someone that I could go on the sub side with, it is, I'll be honest, I think it's more therapeutic than therapy in that it's really like a mental space of me giving up control, which is so hard for me, and to be able to relinquish that control and trust someone to do what they say that they're going to do and to stay within the bounds of what I feel comfortable with. Um, I feel like in the past few years, as I've really explored that, I feel like I've become more like integrated in my
Hmm.
body because of that.
I mean, I feel like that's, I've always said like when I talk about subs, like I almost have like a knot in my throat or something because I feel like, oh my God, it's so like what a bold, vulnerable, intimate place to put yourself in of just
Totally.
trust and intimacy and like, that's that real sort of like it's a deep headspace to put yourself in. And I have to be
Oh yeah.
honest, it's one that I've rarely ever entered because it's that vulnerable.
Yes. Yes.
And it puts me in a
Yes.
place where like I freak out. But maybe those are my trust issues
But
come into
that's yes,
play.
yes. And I think that that, at least for me, like that's a sign that there's something to work on. Now that could be a sign that like you're not with the right person,
Right.
and that you don't feel like you can trust that person. But for me, I feel like as a, growing up, I just felt like I, I think reflecting back on things that I was quite disassociated,
Mm.
from myself and from my life. And when I'm in those sexual environments, it's like nothing exists except the present. Like it brings everything into focus, and I feel for once like united. I think that day to day, I often have like some inner monologue that is talking about like something that happened like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and I'm like still harping on it, like for
Right.
some reason, and I find that really intense, sessions really cuts that voice out, and I have no choice but to be present and be there. For me, like the session's like a meditation. Like that's
Hmm.
it's at that level for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny as we're talking about this and like I'm looking at you and you're sort of like you're giving me Rob Halford, right? And I'm like really into that, right? And I think um because I'm thinking about being a performer and I'm thinking about walking on stage and I'm thinking about there's a moment in the 90s when everything about sort of how I walked on stage changed.
Mm,
And it's funny because thinking about this in the context of this conversation, I
yes.
think about Rob Halford. So Rob Halford used to go on stage with a fucking motorcycle, fucking head to toe in leather, and just like gets off the motorcycle and just starts fucking screaming. And you are like in his world. He is in
Okay.
control, right? Like this is like
Yeah.
a pure Dom move. And so it wasn't him that I necessarily thought about this from. It was Liam Gallagher. But
I
I
did not see
remember,
that.
no, I remember seeing Liam Gallagher walk on stage, hands behind his back, and just his demeanor just completely upright, you know, and just looks into the audience, and there's just a sense of like, I'm in control. And
Mm,
I remember for years there was times where I would walk on stage almost like sheepishly, like, oh, thanks for
sure.
supporting me, you know. And I realized at some point nobody's paying to see that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
where is that? Where if you're gonna be a control freak, at least just walk on and own it.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
You know, find that part of you that is in control and that's like really sort of like fully confident and in that moment. I mean, it's funny because what you're talking about with scenes and whatnot and being fully present, that's sort of what I crave on stage. Like that's what I want. I want to be there fully, and I want to like also like, and this is something I'm still working on. and this also might be relevant to scenes,
Mm.
is trying to be very deliberate about movement, about, and I mean, you know, a scene it's different because there's touch involved and things like that, but like, but sometimes we can sort of like just lose ourselves completely, and there's magic in that,
Yeah,
but also you can get hurt in on
sure.
both in scene and stage. So this sense of being deliberate about your movement, about your thought, about your, you know, your general energy, I think is really also like a part of control that maybe we don't think about often.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you mentioned about like going on the stage in a sheepish kind of like manner, let's say. Um, where do you think that comes from? Like, do you think that was coming from like a place of like insecurity of not necessarily knowing like how to present yourself as a gay man, or was it that you knew that you were gay but you didn't know how the audience would receive you as a gay man? I ask that because like I certainly struggled with similar things, in my line of work in the past, and then I got to the point where I was like, I don't give a shit. But
Right. Well, okay, so there was definitely a period of time where I'd say that I was in the zone of don't look at me, like don't pay attention to me.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
there was this just hiding yourself, shrinking yourself. And that could be confused with modesty, but I sort of think of it more as maybe like a vestige of the closet. Like
hmm,
it's still sort of like this thing of just trying to get away with being there and not being there. Because the more people notice you, the more scrutiny you might find. And when you're in the closet, that you don't want scrutiny.
yes.
So that's one thing. Um, I also think that, like most gay men, I would probably say, uh, my struggle with my own self worth is uh, well documented, and
Yeah.
and I think, like, you know, I think there was a part of me that genuinely felt like I don't deserve this,
Mm,
you know, and it's tough because you never want to get into a place of entitlement of any kind.
sure.
I don't ever want to feel entitled to anything like that. But I
Yeah.
do feel like there's a difference between entitlement and being okay and saying like, no, I earned that. I did
Hmm.
something good. Like, hooray for me.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I find that what I struggle with, it wasn't until about 2020, like right before the pandemic, like before the shutdown, that I started having birthday parties. Like before that, I would never have a birthday party for myself, and I wouldn't even tell people it was
Steve,
my birthday.
we might be the same person. I didn't tell anybody when my birthday was until I was like in my 30s, like well into my 30s.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then I was like, you know what? No, like I go to everyone else's parties, like when they're celebrating it, like I should have people over to celebrate my life and, to have a good time. But I was all in this like, you know, every day is the same, like we're all gonna die, life is suffering,
Right.
like Buddhist bullshit. And I kind of wish I was like, no, like I'm gonna just enjoy life, and if that means having people over for my birthday, I'm gonna do that. But I think, like, going back to my family, a lot of the birthday celebrations I had as a very young kid, I just don't have many good memories. Like I just remember always like turning into a drama scene.
Right.
That by the age of like 9 or 10, I was like, I don't want anything to do with this. We're not having a party because someone in my family will always make the drama out of it, and
Right.
make it about them instead of the person who the day is about. And,
I mean,
yeah.
when you say it, when you go back that far, I realize that maybe my weird tendency to not celebrate my birthday for so many years was based on the fact that my family never celebrated my birthday. I never
Mm,
had a birthday party as a child. Never. Not one. Not one where they
yeah.
were like, invite your friends and we're gonna have cake and we're gonna have like, nope, no, not one.
I,
And that's why I'm
yeah.
very peculiar about my birthday rituals now.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
very important to me. So for years,
Yes.
my partner didn't fully understand the importance of one thing, which is that I have to eat birthday cake on my birthday.
Sure.
But when I say birthday cake, I'm very specific about what birthday cake is. It's not red velvet cake with a candle in it.
Okay.
It's not, it's not chocolate cake. It's like a birthday cake is a vanilla cake with buttercream frosting and confetti sprinkles on it. And the way I finally got it through, because years would go and he would get me the wrong cake, and I'd be like, oh my God. Like, no. Um, but finally, one year, I said, look, if we went to the ice cream shop
Yeah.
and you saw birthday cake ice cream on the menu, what
Mhm.
would that be? And he was like, it would probably be like vanilla with sprinkles. And I was like, yes. That is birthday cake. Everything else is just cake. Cake with a candle on your birthday, but it's not birthday cake. So anyway, we all have
That's
sort of
funny.
specific rituals.
What's popping in my head is, like as a kid, the birthday cake that my mom would get me was called a brown derby cake, which is a cake that has lots of fruit in it. So it has like strawberries, I want to say bananas, lots of whipped cream, and I think that there might also be some like cocoa mixed in with like a vanilla um, cake. I have never made it myself. However, this party that I'm referencing, the last party before COVID is what I call it. Um, a friend of mine made it for me. I was like, I would really appreciate if you could make this for me. And he made the cake, and it was my first like birthday party really ever, like as an adult, and I
Right.
had this cake, and I just felt like, there was this like coming together of my friends, but also like reuniting myself or like my youth self in a way.
Right. Well, I mean, as we're speaking too, I should say that, I'll be in Syracuse in September, and now I'm
Yes,
feeling like the leather cook has to make me a birthday cake. It's a little late, but still.
it's gonna be late. I could always, I'll make you something. I'll make you something.
It's funny. I do feel like the all the stuff like I've been doing a lot of thinking this week about punk and
Mm,
about uh and also like about our conversation that we had earlier in the week.
mm,
We were talking about different facets of leather, and like um one of the things that I sort of was remembering or thinking about a lot this week is gatekeeping.
okay. Yeah.
And I've been thinking about it mostly in punk world because I've started uh this publication again,
Hmm.
antimatter, and it's forced me to sort of think about like the community that I'm moving into again. As a writer anyway, I've never left the community, but I stopped writing about it for a long time, and one of the sort of like key things that sort of keeps coming up as I think about the history of punk and sort of like my history with it is the gatekeeping aspect of it. What
Okay.
makes you punk, right? What makes you hardcore? And it reminded me a little bit of the conversation that we had. Like, well, what does that mean to be leather? And
Hmm.
what, like, who decides? Who's the big leather god in the sky with a book of
Right,
leather?
right. So tell us, what do you think? Where are you in this
So
process?
it's interesting. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about, um, well, one, I've been thinking a lot about the analogy that I sort of made in our conversation, um, with gay identity
Mm,
versus leather identity. So obviously, since no one else was in our conversation but us, I'll I'll say it again. But the analogy being that when you are gay and celibate, right? Does that mean you're not gay? So meaning that what does being gay mean? People my entire life, right? And your entire life, I'm sure, equated queerness with an activity.
yes.
And so the idea being that if you just refrain from this activity, then you are not this thing. And I think most of us were like, no, that's bullshit. I'm
Yeah.
always that thing,
Well,
right?
clearly,
Like,
because like straight people would never accept that about themselves, right? Like if
mhm.
a straight person was celibate, they would still identify as straight, right? Like they would
Obviously, right,
never like give up that that's the default, right?
right, absolutely. And I think that that's so thinking about queer identity in that way, realizing that there's something that's intrinsic to who you are about it that may or may not reflect the activities that you're currently engaged in, made me think a little bit more about leather in that way, made me think about
Mm.
punk in that way. It sort of like
Hmm.
made me think about a lot of things where I was like, I really want to understand what is it about these things. And people can argue, oh, but that's different. Like being gay is a very discrete sexual orientation. Leather and punk are these like sort of communities or whatnot.
Mm.
But people used to say that about being gay as well, right?
Right.
That being gay was just like some weird small community thing that, and honestly, up until the late 19th century, it didn't even have a name. Like the word
Exactly.
homosexuality didn't even exist. So
Right.
what the fuck was it, right? So I guess that's the thing. There's a there's something about this that rings true with my study of ethnicity.
Mm.
Um, so I'll try to make this less convoluted, but like in my master's degree, I did a sociolinguistic study of Polari, the gay language.
Yes.
And in that study, I started thinking about language as a component of ethnicity, and I started thinking about ethnicity deeper as a whole. And one of the things that I discovered, which I'd never really thought about before, was so ethnicity is a kind of fluid category. It doesn't mean race. It doesn't mean culture. Uh, ethnicity is actually a self-determined category. So it's when a group of people decide that the sort of ways of being that they share are different from the groups around them.
Hmm.
Sometimes they cluster into what eventually becomes to be known as an ethnicity. And so
Hmm.
I was curious about this idea of a queer ethnicity
Yeah.
because I was like, I like this idea of self identification. And I think also that's sort of like leading me into this place for leather and it's leading me into this place for punk where I'm feeling like I have a good friend in England and I just did an interview with him for antimatter and his this interview is based on the premise that he is not really looked at as a hardcore kid,
Mm.
but he does have this hardcore history. He loves the music. And, even though his band is a dance punk band, they're called Friendly Fires and they're like pretty big in the UK. Hardcore has already always been a part of who he is. And so
Yeah.
we were sort of discussing that and he continued to sort of like refuse to identify as a hardcore kid. And I was like, you literally just went to a show by a super underground hardcore band last week that I would have never gone to.
Yeah.
Like you were there, you're contributing, you're a part of the community,
Yeah.
you know. And he was just like, oh, I guess I am, you know. It was like this, he felt like there was like I said to him, I was like, what do you feel like you missed a test or something that you can't claim it now?
Yeah.
But ultimately it's about that sense of being, of knowing who you are, what you're sort of like resonating with,
Hmm.
and who your people are. And I think that all of those things together sort of create this nexus of self-identification that I think is valid. And I don't ever want to be the person to try to snuff that out on either of those wings, really.
Totally, totally. I think while you're speaking, what came up in my head was really the power of the internet when it comes to understanding all of these different cultures and, let's say, queer ethnicities and just different ways of being. Because, at least for me, growing up in a very small town, it was the internet that at the age of 12, I was able to first come out to people and explore my queer identity in a safe space with people that were complete strangers, that if they had a bad reaction, I could step away.
Right.
And it allowed me to figure out how to navigate that conversation, when I eventually would have it with people in my life. I was able to test the grounds and figure that out. But also, I feel like the internet, especially with Instagram, has allowed me to connect with so many more leather people than I normally would have contact with, and to stay in contact with them, to develop friendships, to develop community. And I just feel like the internet has given us an outlet or a tool for us to really connect with these like micro communities, or these communities that are less mainstream, where we can sometimes find ourselves, where we may be like, wow, like like that's how I feel with the leather community. Like, here are people that have like a similar, not just like psychological makeup to me, but also like sensory makeup to me, that they are perceiving the world, that they are um, excited or turned off by similar things. And there's a desire to also talk about those things.
Mm-hmm.
I find, as we've talked about, like, I hate small talk. Like, I don't want to talk about, uh, clouds or whatever people talk about. I mean, like, I want to go deep, and I feel like the internet has really just provided that landscape,
Well,
and I,
people, I think we have a tendency to go, and I don't know why this is. Maybe it is that there's a, and I hate to say that it's a false sense of security, but maybe sometimes there is a false sense of security in speaking to people on the internet. Right? Like you don't really know who you're talking
right.
to. But I was speaking with someone who may be or may not be in the room right now.
Hmm.
Um, but um, uh, but someone who had started following me after you had posted about the upcoming
Yeah.
thing, and we got into this really deep conversation. And I was like, and I said to him, I just want to say, like, by the way, that like I really appreciate your willingness to be open with a basic stranger right now, and that like I really just want you to know that I honor that. And I sort of make that a point to say in these
Yes.
situations. I want to articulate that because I want people to understand that what we're doing when we're relating with each other in a deep way in basic anonymity, it's something that like I think is good and that I actually cherish, and that I don't want anyone to think
Yes.
that this is stupid or that that we shouldn't have those
Or
conversations.
or that it's not something that should be taken for granted. It is
Absolutely.
something that should be like acknowledged and recognized as like the gift that it is, because so many of us grew up in households in which we were really denied such connection, or when we sought out such connection, we were ridiculed or made fun of, or so forth. And so I think it's important to really call out the power of just communication. Um, I've been really reflecting that there is something that you said in our last conversation, and I'm not going to get the words correct, but you had something akin to, basically you said something like that you feel very protective of, um, like not just queer identity, but queer children, queer adults, and basically being like this father figure, uh, as a way. And I feel like that's going along with what you're communicating at the moment, is being this person who is able to fill a void that, that void exists because of our culture or because of the failings of our parents. You're able to fill that void, and um, you want them to understand that it is something that, it is a void, it is something that's
Yeah.
lacking. Um, but like,
I mean, this is also where I would say the punk and sort of queer experiences, I think for me, intersect in a real way,
yes,
which
yes,
is that I think that, so I'm, I just turned 49. I'm
yes.
very Gen X. And and so I know that, come like coming of age when I did, the idea of a queer future was not a given.
Right.
Um, in the 80s, everyone and everything was against us. You know, when
Mm-hmm.
when AIDS
Yes.
was sort of like in its prime in terms of the public eye, we were in danger in every direction. And
Yes.
there and as we know, like there were a great number of queer men who didn't survive it,
Mm-hmm.
who then weren't there to sort of provide that like sage wisdom or advice or sort
Yes.
of, to be our queer elders. A lot of people did survive, and that's amazing, but we still didn't have a blueprint for what a queer future looked like, what a
Right.
true and free queer future might look like. That was still something that like everybody was just like looking in the dark for.
Mm-hmm.
I felt the same way as a young punk kid, because punk is a youth subculture. And in the 80s and even early 90s, there was no blueprint for what that looked like. So, like,
Mm.
this morning, I was looking at an interview that I did in 1995 where somebody asked me about the future. And I brought up this guy who I was like, this guy who goes to shows in New Jersey, and he only has two T-shirts. He wears like a Dead Kennedys Nazi Punks Fuck Off shirt or a Gorilla Biscuits T-shirt, and I was like, and he just like, I remember some friends like were like, yo, asking about his record collection. He must be like 40 years old, like I was talking to him about him. I described it like talking about him like a mythical creature. Like, oh my
Yes.
God, the rare 40-year-old punk. Like what can we learn from this specimen? The idea that you could be a 40-year-old punk, and what was so fucked up was that like my answer was basically like, now I don't know if I want to be like that when I'm 40. Right? Like I was dissing this guy essentially who did nothing wrong, was doing amazing shit, was supporting the scene,
Yeah.
didn't bother anyone, goes to the shows, buys the records, like all this. And I was like dissing him. That was sort of what it was like as a young queer. Like in the 80s and 90s, I would see the older queers as, oh yeah, these guys like chicken hawks, or like,
Sure.
you there was no intergenerational conversation.
Mm.
And so that's where the internet, for both punk and queerness and leather, I think is really a great thing
Mm,
because it sort of has normalized intergenerational conversations. It has not just normalized them, but actually elevated
mm,
them, where
mm,
people now are looking for who's your punk elder, who's your queer elder, who's your leather elder, who can we learn from? And I think that those conversations are maybe the most valuable conversations that we can have, honestly. Like when I think about some of like, my queer elders who've sort of like been able to be there for me and even just sort of like just put things in a different perspective and make me realize like how lucky I probably have it. um, it's been so rich and valuable to my life
mm,
to have that.
mm.
And so yeah, what you're saying, that element of wanting to be or tapping into that sort of protector or nurturer or sort of like that vibe, that daddy vibe, whether it be punk or queer or whatever, I
Yeah.
think is something that as I get older, I want to be there, basically. I'm not searching you out, but if there's someone who's in a younger position who wants an intergenerational conversation that, makes sense, then it's like I'm willing to have those conversations.
Mm,
I'd like to be that person.
mm. So then going back to this interview question that you're talking about from 95, how would you answer that today? Like, where do you see the future or whatever? Like, what what do you think are like 10 years from now? How do you think, or how would you like, let's say, the gay community or the leather community or the mainstream community, like what changes do you want to see? Or what changes do you not want to see, but you see coming down the road?
So, I mean, I'd say as far as queer people go, I think the biggest thing for me is to fight against this queer segregation that seems to be coming in some ways. Um, I think that we had this
Talk a little bit
moment
more
where,
about that.
yeah, I
Can
think
you
so. I think
define
we,
that?
um, so essentially, it's right now. I'd say it's at its most vulgar with the whole LGB without the T,
Okay.
uh, you know, sort of weird
Yeah.
thing that's bubbling up. Um, it's this is maybe one of those reasons why intergenerational conversations matter, right? Because these people are sort of like rewriting the history of trans people in our community and in our struggle, and
Mhm.
they're diminishing them, and if anything saying that they've been, dead weight in the
Mhm.
struggle, and that really couldn't be further from the truth. So that element of segregation, and that would be for any level of queerness. So this also goes back to conversations that we've had about quote unquote respectability politics, about the marginalization of leather people. This idea that, oh, well, I'm gay, but I'm not that kind of gay, right? Like
Yes.
I'm not,
Yes.
that's also a type of queer segregation
Hmm.
that only hurts us. We have to sort of get to this place. I think one of the things about leather or kink or anything that we have to sort of understand is this. For my entire life, just plain old vanilla gay sex meant you were a pervert. You were a criminal, you're a pervert,
Hmm.
you're a sinner, you're a degenerate. For the most loving vanilla gay sex that you can imagine.
Right.
So if that is the bar, then why are we judging anything above the bar?
Exactly. Exactly.
Just do you. And so there's that element of segregation just from that is very harmful to our community as a whole, because I think it's playing into the expectations and roles that straight people or that oppressors really have
Mm.
been using to divide us and conquer us for ages, to
Mm.
make you feel like shit, no matter where
Hmm.
you are. And
Yes.
we also see this now, even legally speaking, like now in Texas, They're re-looking at the right to for same-sex marriage based on the Supreme Court's new
Yes.
"it's okay to discriminate against gays" thing. And so it's like, I'm sorry, but if you can't read the tea leaves, you're not looking.
Yes. Yes.
They'll come for trans people, they'll come for leather people, they'll come for fucking Pete Buttigieg. It doesn't fucking matter.
Right.
So it's so important right now that we not do this to ourselves and that we create the strongest, most cohesive, together community that we can be. All the letters, all the kinks, all everything. We need to be together because if we're not, number one, we're going to lose.
Hmm.
And number two, we're also going to lose a huge part of our history because we didn't have the luxury of segregation in the past. There weren't enough visible out queer and trans people to create that movement in the past.
Yeah.
Now that there are, we have to be seen and we have to be seen together.
And I think, again, going back to the power of the internet, I think that the internet has allowed people to see different ways of living. And I think that is partly responsible for there being like higher proportions of people identifying as LGBTQ, at least, when you
Mm-hmm.
look from, Gen Z to, you know, baby boomers or the silent generation. I think the fact that, younger kids have been seeing alternative ways of living other than what like Disney wants us to believe is the only way to live. I think that that has really sparked um, that. And I think it goes back to what you're just saying of like understanding that leather people are a part of the greater like LGBTQ community and that we need to be together in this fight because things at least in America, but I feel like in other places around the world are are becoming less friendly to us
Yeah,
in some ways. Yeah.
100%. And it's really, it's difficult. Um, I will say this, like, I know that you had mentioned something about like kids that are sort of like on the internet and they're sort of maybe seeking these like alternative ways of being. But I also think that a lot of what we have right now is that we're finally just getting language for things. And I think
That's
that
true too.
that's something that's like, you know, we have to sort of understand that, I mentioned earlier, right? Like the word homosexual didn't exist until the late uh, 19th century, I think it was. And so when that word came into being, and by the way, it only came into being as a way of pathologizing
Right.
us.
Right.
But when it came into being, it created a unifying principle. It created a way in which we could identify and identify each other and become stronger together. And
Hmm.
so now people are definitely having that situation where it's like there's language for this. Like, I have two godchildren that are both um, non-binary and trans.
Mm.
And, it's like I know for a fact that if they grew up when I was growing up, that would have been a million times harder. And it was hard for them. So even with the
Yeah.
language. So my whole thing is that basically, I think about them and I think about sort of like, them as being the young, next generation and just wanting them to feel fully supported, um, however I can. And so that absolutely extends to people that are not my godchildren.
Mm.
But maybe, like in queer land, I mean, we talk about like, oh, that's my godchild all the time.
Yes. Yes.
So maybe I have plenty of godchildren.
Yeah. And I think that, one of the what's the right word to say here? I mean, one of the benefits or like magical things in queer land is this ability, I think, to create like a chosen family that I think a lot of straight people just don't understand how powerful that is to be able to do that. And I don't think a lot of straight people ever have to even think about doing that. And when I have tried to explain this to people, I don't think that they understand the importance
Hmm.
of, you know, the found family and so forth. Um, that, you know, for me at least, I feel like my life has been transformed by having people in my life who finally support me for me, you know,
Right.
that I'm not trying to walk on eggshells and present myself as someone so that I'll get along with someone else, you know, and not, you know, go against their morals or their values or
Right.
whatever. Like, I think it's so liberating. Like, the feelings I've had when I go to like IML, for instance, like, it's so crazy because it's like, this is the, like, when I went to IML 2 years ago, it was like the first time that I was like, I felt accepted in a large group of people. Like I just didn't like I was able to relax.
Mm.
And I was like this I'd never been to like a summer camp ever before, but this felt like a summer camp, you know, and going back this year it felt like, oh, you know, I'm running into all these people, I'm saying hi, like it was really nice, but I just had never had that as a child.
So
Like,
let me ask you,
yeah,
because I think this will be interesting to me.
yeah,
So one person that I mentioned earlier who I had that conversation with, you know, we talked about our place in the community and
yeah.
leather specifically. So do you still ever get into a situation where you're like, IML is a great place for this? Do you ever get into a situation where you're at IML and you're like walking around and you're like, am I leather enough?
I I guess no. I guess I don't have that. Well, I got that in Berlin. Okay, Berlin was
Okay.
a little bit different, I will say.
They're hardcore.
Um, because yeah, I mean like in Berlin, I forget exactly what I was wearing. I think I was wearing like a harness, but I had like a mirror cap on, and it really was a deviation from like the formal Leatherman look.
Mm.
And I remember I was at this bar, and like I could tell that these men were talking about me. Like, and I was like, what the fuck is your problem? Like, so, you know, and I definitely feel like in the American leather scene, there's way more flexibility, you know, and you see this a lot. I know that there's more contestants that play with gender and play with shape more so than like the European
Mm.
contestants. And so I definitely felt like in Europe that there was like a strict standard of like, this is how you're leather. And if you're not doing this, then you're doing it wrong. And I really hate, like, I can't, don't, like, I'm not going to color in the lines. Like, how
Right, right,
boring. Like, that's
right,
not the point of life. Like, that is not the point. And if you think that that's the point, you're not living.
right.
So, yeah, I mean, I've had those uncomfortable situations, but it doesn't make me question whether I'm leather or not. I'm just like, no, like,
Well, it's
this
not
is what
leather
I'm
or
doing.
not, but leather enough.
Yeah.
Do certain people make you feel that still? I just think it's interesting because I feel like, you know, when we talk about leather, for me it's always fun. Like I love having conversations with you about it because it feels like um, you know, we're always trying to sort of like come to some sort of place where we're like, where our understandings meet, right? But I feel like there are so many understandings, unless you're hardcore old guard
Yeah.
or, you know, something like that, where they're just like, where there are rules, right?
Yes.
And and clearly like I'm not so good at rules.
Well, I think that's why we get along because we it's probably why like although I don't like identify as a punk, I feel like leather is a way to connect with like my punkish side.
Right, right. I mean,
Yeah.
and you know, like I've certainly met people in the punk community that were less punk than you. So, so you know, like I said,
Yeah,
self-identify, do what you got to do.
exactly.
But I feel like, you know, that this question I think is always something that's really interesting to me because I do think that it's one of the things that, um, you know, I've seen a lot of people, especially like people that are like, you know, like in New York, the
Mm,
current Mr. Eagle, you know,
yes.
has talked about, and like that sense of like, how do you get people to come to the Eagle and feel like they belong, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not like, you know, someone's at the door looking at your outfit and like, I mean, you know, on gear nights, obviously you got to wear gear, but like, you know what I'm saying? It's like on a
Hmm.
regular night, no one's judging you by, you know, oh, well, that leather looks too new or, you know,
Right. Right.
it's just not like that. So how do you create that inclusivity?
I mean, I think that the Eagle is a great example because it allows people from all walks of life to enter in. Now, I mean, at least, the last time I was there, there's lots of guys in jeans and t-shirts and so forth. So if they happen to be curious
Right.
about checking out that space, then they can do so. Um, and about inclusivity, I think that, again, going back to the internet is a great place to like connect with people, but also to just like learn about different subcultures that you can be like, okay, what do people in this subculture do? Or what are some events and so forth. So I feel like you can use the tools to learn more information about it. And I think the one thing that people find really intimidating about leather is the cost. Like if
Mm,
you're going to go for a full leather outfit, it can be
right.
expensive. But, when I first started getting into leather, all I had was this harness, right? Like I've had this harness for about 10 years, and I would go to various leather clubs in Europe and just have this harness and they would let me in, and that was another way for me to explore that scene. And so, yeah, I mean, at least for me, I feel like you have to invest a little, like buy something and, think about it as like a memento from that time. But it gets you a ticket into places that might otherwise be closed off, in places that have like a strict code. And I think that there's no harm in just trying something out or just
Right.
going and observing and seeing how you feel in a place, um, and better understanding what are your desires, but also for me, because a lot of sex is psychological for me, understanding yourself on that level and getting to that understanding the things that really push you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's funny when you talk about trying it on because, and literally and figuratively, right?
Yes.
Um, there's there's a story that I always think about in my life that it sort of haunts me a little bit.
Mm.
So, all right, so many years ago in the early 2010s, I hosted a TV show. I think I told you this, right?
I don't know if I remember those.
So I hosted a TV show on Here TV, the gay network, and
Okay.
it was called Here's the Deal, and it was really called The Deal, but they were trying to be cute about it. I guess
Okay.
they were like, "Here's the deal," because it was Here TV. Anyway,
Oh.
so it was on Here TV, and so it was sort of a pop culture type show, but or at least that's how it was pitched to me when they asked me to start hosting it.
Okay.
Um, but you know, we would do like on the street type segments, and like we'd go to like you know, obviously went did one at Stonewall and did you know different
Yeah.
places. So at this point, Nasty Pig was brand new.
Mm.
right? It was a pretty brand new brand, and they just opened up their shop in Chelsea, and they wanted to do a segment at Nasty Pig, and I was like, okay, cool. So we did a segment, and I was there with the owner. I think his name was David, and he showed me around, and he really wanted me to try on some things. And at the time, it's not like Nasty Pig was like formal leather wear or anything like that. You know what I mean? Like it was still
Hmm.
pretty fetishy sportswear kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I was still so in my head about like I still had the respectability gay so in
Sure.
my head that
Yes.
I could not even allow myself to try on something from fucking Nasty Pig in like 2010. I was just like, no, it's cool. I'm good. And I think that that experience really made me like I've actually kept that experience with me ever since. Like
Mm.
I've almost felt a weird sense of shame about it. Like what's wrong with you? Why were you that concerned with sort of like how you were projecting yourself in public in a way that maybe didn't quote unquote fit your brand?
Hmm.
And it's really nice to just be in a place in my life now where I don't give a shit at all. That I really
Yes.
want to be who I am all the time. And it
Yes.
doesn't matter. And if I want to, hang out with the leather cook in his kitchen, we're going to hang out. you know, if I want to go fucking live blog from in front of the Eagle tonight, I'll do
Yes.
that. It's
Yeah.
it's really this is the thing that I'm saying about, this lack of segregation among queer people. That's the only way we get freedom.
Hmm. So can I ask you, do you happen to own any Nasty Pig at the
I
moment?
actually don't still. But it's not I'm not going to say why, but I don't.
But I also, I have something similar. I mean, I'm trying to form this in a coherent way. Um, but what's the best way of saying this? Like, I would say that I see, if we go back like 10 years ago, like, I would see friends of mine walking around town or like at a restaurant with like a Nasty Pig hat on, like the little like NP with the little pig nose one. And always remember being like a little bit envious of them that they had the confidence to wear that hat out in a non-gay only space.
Mm,
And I now feel like when I look back, I feel like I've come a long way. That now I can walk outside of my house in leather gear or wearing whatever just because I don't give a shit anymore. And I feel like it's a survival mechanism. I feel like, as gay people, at least for me, like I knew I was gay from a very young age. And I analyzed myself to a T, and because my parents and my sisters made fun of me and knew the things that they identified as gay, because those were the things that were made fun of. And so then I tried to downplay those things all my life. And so my 20s, like I keep trying to downplay my gayness, and it's this survival mechanism that kept me safe as a child because I had no way of really escaping my family and being in a healthy situation that I could um, you just not really present my gay self for so long.
yeah.
And now this Instagram has really helped me show my like all my sides and
Right.
my very gay side. And the thing that I have been very like appreciative of is to be like respected but also like encouraged by that gayness and people like encouraging me on those representations of things that I've always been like so afraid to share because it really harkens back to childhood shit and not being treated well for just being myself.
Right. And I mean, it's been interesting because like, so, uh, I mean, I don't know how I ever found you, right? Like,
Yeah, I
I'm
don't
a
know
Cook with
how
Steve
we found each
follower.
other.
I remember Cook with Steve. That's,
Yeah. You're like an OG follower.
and I was like, oh, this Steve looks like a very nice boy. And then before I knew it, it
And
was
then
like, okay.
and then he starts wearing leather and you're like,
Right.
what's going on? Are you
Right.
okay?
I watched this sort of evolution and but to be fair, like, the evolution it actually felt fairly natural. Like it didn't feel like you went from like nice boy Steve to like, cigar chomping daddy or something like overnight or anything like that. And what was nice about it was that it was sort of watching someone just becoming a little more comfortable just with their own presence,
Hmm.
and like it never felt like you were performing. It always, and I think one of the things about your online presence that I think is something that people should take notes of, if I'm being honest,
Thank you.
is that you don't have a one-dimensional performance. You're not just, all leather all the time, right? Like
Right.
you can be sitting around in shorts and a t-shirt, pouring coffee and having fun. Like, you can be a lot of the aspects of who you are.
Hmm.
And there's never this feeling, I think also that you have to present in a certain way. I love the way that you're just you talk exactly the same way all the time, whether you're full cow or
Right.
business cash, right? And that's like, that's something I think especially on social media, I think we see these projections of leather men sometimes that feel a little overwrought, in my
Yeah.
opinion. Because I think that leather, like punk, in my opinion, is a community that is interested in finding the realest version of themselves.
Mm. What do you think it is about leather that helps that happen? That helps us either to like self-actualize or to find the realist version of ourselves? And I've spent, I mean, for me, I'll answer this first and then let you
Mhm.
go. For me, I think about leather and I think about who wears leather. You either see someone riding a motorcycle, or you see gays, right? Like to me, leather is like almost the gayest thing that I can wear. And to walk around town in leather is to basically be like, I'm owning my gayness. Like, try to
Mm.
fuck me up. Try to call me, you know, a slur because I'm going to own it, right? Because I'm that comfortable with myself. Um, so, yeah, I mean, what's your relationship there? What do you think it is?
I think that, um, and I think I've sort of expressed this one point to you before, how when I think of like the leather mind, I think that one of the sort of key traits of it is exploration,
Mm,
a
yeah.
willingness to go there,
Mm,
right? To put yourself in scenarios um, that you might not be comfortable with.
yeah.
And if we're being honest, whether you're talking about leather play or life in general, the situations that we put ourselves in where we are the most uncomfortable are the ones where we find ourselves the most.
when you say we find ourselves the most, you mean like we discover ourselves, like
Yeah.
not that we spend the most time in,
Right.
but
No, no, no,
that
no.
we
That
find,
the place,
yes,
it's
okay,
the place where we learn the most about
yes,
ourselves, right?
yes,
Like
yeah,
whenever you're put into a scenario that's stressful, that is uncertain, whenever you have to take a leap of faith, right? Like all these things, like when we were talking about before, even about subspace and sort of like that mindset of like being vulnerable and
yeah.
just having to put your trust in someone that they're going to do the things they said they were going to do. Right? That your negotiation was clear. Whatever it is, you're still putting yourself, in a place where there's going to be a little bit of fear. That's sort of where the endorphins come from.
Yes,
Um, and that all of those parts of the mind at play are the parts of the mind that really push you to act in your most natural primal way,
mm,
right? Fight or flight is the most natural physical reaction that you can have. And when you're put in those scenarios where you feel that visceral, like, whoa, like intensity of
yes,
experience, again, whether it's weather or whether it's your day to day life, those are the places where yourself becomes clear.
yes. Yeah, what's going on in my head is as you're talking about fight or flight, I'm thinking about a scenario in which perhaps like someone is restrained, like on a chair. They cannot fight and they cannot fly. So, um, what do
That we
they
know of.
do? Are they fawning? Like, is that the adjective or the verb here of like, because there it's like you have to you're fighting against your fight or flight mechanism. You are basically trying to accept what is happening to you in a way, um, and not fight about it and really be there in the moment. So it makes me wonder, like, what's the right way to describe that? Is that fawning,
Well,
or
I can
what?
I can I can go into this in I mean it's funny because earlier I can't remember what you were talking about, but you said something about like, oh, this Buddhist bullshit. But actually this is a very key this is so for anybody who doesn't know, I do practice Zen Buddhism. But like this is a very key sort of idea in Zen Buddhism. And I think this image that you sort of painted about being restrained, not being able to physically um, fight or flee.
Yeah,
Like, what do you do? Right.
yeah,
And so there is this thing about in Zen Buddhism that we call as it isness. And in as it isness, it's the it's sort of the goal in a lot of ways, but the idea is that you have to look at the scenario that you are in
mm,
exactly as it is, not in any other way, past, present, or otherwise, as it
mm,
is. And if your scenario as it is I am restrained, I can't get out, then you have to find other ways with which to cope, other
mm-hmm.
ways with which to sort of like um, find whatever peace that you can find.
Yes.
And so that sense of that challenge really is the challenge of everyday Zen Buddhism. But
Mm.
yeah, you can create some intense scenes out of it as well. Because it's not easy. I think that's the point.
Right, right.
It's not easy. It's not I'm not saying that like, oh, check me out, I'm the Buddha over here. Like that's not no. If you restrain me, I will bug out.
Naturally, yes,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
exactly.
Yeah, I think I recognize how not easy it is just because of past experiences. And so when I have people approach me and they say something like, I want to be your slave, and I can see like, or I know that they have no experience or very little experience, to me it's like kind of like a red flag because I'm like, you don't quite understand where I'm gonna go with this.
I don't think you know what you're asking for.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
it's
I think to add on to that, I feel like in, let's say, outside the leather scene, I feel like there's a predominance to focus just on like anal sex. And I feel like the leather scene, there is way more play to understand the whole sensory world
right,
that we live in and how our bodies are connecting, how we're wired, and playing with all of those different senses and our wiring. And so for someone to, with like very little experience, to be like, I want that, I'm like, well, you kind of have to experience some of that first
right,
before you know that that's what you
right,
want, right? Like
right,
that's, yeah. So it makes me like a little worried because I'm like, you shouldn't be using those words lightly. I think like
right.
if you use those words, I feel like there should be more intention, and it's not just like something you say, right? Like it just felt like, oh, this is like play acting.
It certainly doesn't feel like anything I would say um, whimsically.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if there's any sense of whimsy there, I would say run. Um, but I also want to say that I think, what you talked about just now about sensory sort of play and also sort of how that's very, very intrinsic to the leather experience, I think. And I mean, obviously, I think leather is a tactile material. It's
Mhm.
something that for a lot of people, the touch of leather itself is the thing,
Yeah.
right? So like, um, but I also think you don't talk enough about how that plays into the leather cook, because I do feel like, you know, your sensuality is sort of what brings you to this place of cooking to begin with.
Mm.
And I that's also something that
Yes.
I love. I think it's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's a great point. I think that I've tried to do some writing myself on that, but it is something that I've I always hope that it's something that's in between the lines, that people are
Mm,
understanding on that. But I think that I probably should spend a little bit more time talking about that directly to understand that, um, like for instance, when I have the coffee, it's so funny because like I've been asked, and I would say it's like mostly by straight people. They'll be like, "What's the coffee pour mean?" And I'm like, what do you mean? What does it mean? What does that question even mean? Like, why does this one thing have to have like one interpretation? Like, it could mean a lot of different things.
right,
It could mean
right,
nothing. It could mean everything, right? Like, and for me, I would say I tend to think about the coffee pours as like, here's something that we take for granted, right? Like it's just like, oh, I want some coffee, I'm gonna have some coffee. Well, why not take this one thing that I do like every day and document it and like have a little ritual about it and like really praise it. It's the simple thing, but it really makes the experience that much more meaningful.
and
And yeah,
that's
go
like
for
the
it.
thing. That's the thing. So like for me, it's the ritualization. It's
Hmm.
the turning something. This is actually also Zen Buddhist, which is really funny. Oh wow, like you're so Zen, you don't even know it.
I
Um,
I mean, like I've read a lot of like Buddhist texts when I was like in my 20s. So
but
it
but so
yeah.
Zen is sort of known as the ritual form of Buddhism, meaning that like when you go into a Zen center, there's a way of being. There's a way of walking into the meditation hall. There's a way of approaching each other. There's a way. There's all these different sort of. There's an entire liturgy of
Mm.
of ritual, and the ritual's not what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's not religious. It's not. There's no sense of divinity attached to it, other
Okay.
than the divinity of people doing something together as a way of inherently understanding and feeling their interconnectedness.
Mm.
And also being able to sort of appreciate the imperfections of it. Because even
Yes.
10 people trying to say the same words at the same time, it's going to sound like a mess, or
Right.
someone's going to fuck up or whatever. And no one gets, you don't get chastised for fucking up. It's part of the ritual to appreciate, right?
But it's also like, yeah, we're human and like nothing's ever perfect, right? I
Right.
mean, like,
And so the idea behind Zen ritual is making something that's seemingly banal feel extraordinary.
mhm.
And something like pouring coffee, something we all do, or most of us do
Yeah.
every single day, is maybe the most banal thing of all. And you've turned it into this sort of like ASMR
Yes.
like experience that, to me is actually very leather.
Thank you. I feel like yes, you have I feel like you've understood what I'm doing. My whole artistic vision. Yes, I'm waiting for you to write the intro of my future biography.
I'm here for it. But that stuff is really like it. Maybe the Zen part really, because at first we're all very, I think, maybe still shell shocked in the church, especially gay men,
Mhm,
um, where like the idea of ritual sometimes frightens us. And when I
mhm.
first started going to Zen centers, I was like, ooh, this doesn't feel good. I don't like this. And it took a minute to really understand how to make ritual a part of your life in
Yes,
a way that's positive and that
yeah.
expresses something deep about yourself.
And I think connected to that also for me, putting on leather in of itself is another ritual that I partake in because if I'm looking to, either access a part of myself, sometimes that might be easier done in leather, or, if I'm having someone over for a particular scene, putting on the leather is the beginning of the scene for me. Like it's the warm up phase, and there is some ritual there as well. That I feel like, again, what I'm trying to call forward is there are just so many like banal things that we do every day, whether it's like pour coffee, butter toast, whatever, that in of itself it's like meaningless, but like we should be appreciating the simple things.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, do you know
yeah,
how hard it is? I think about this every morning when I brush my teeth, and I have this, one of those electric toothbrushes
yeah.
that buzzes every 30 seconds. And I get so impatient sometimes when I'm like, all right, already, buzz. Get to the next side of my mouth. Like, what the fuck? I can't even brush my teeth without trying to like just come on already. Fuck, like I can't wait
Right.
30 seconds, like 30 seconds. So these rituals, um, these sort of ways that we can intentionally slow down
Hmm.
and experience something and not rush it and get all of the gifts that those banal things actually have for us, like
Yes.
that's everything.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And that speaks, I think, to the sensuality conversation, right? When you're putting on your leather, you're feeling it, you're hearing it, you're smelling
Mm-hmm.
it. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot that's going on that if you stop and pay attention, your experience is so much different than if
Yes.
you don't pay attention at all.
exactly, exactly. And to have a session with another person or groups of people, if one is so lucky, that they have a similar attitude towards life in which they appreciate even those fine details. The sight of the leather, the crunchiness, the smell of the leather, and so forth. There is this heightened sensuality there that I feel like
Hmm.
is really missed in the culture that is just seeking to go from whole to whole and not really appreciate anything else there, you know, and sure, that's fun in of itself, but I always have a hard time describing leather to non-leather people, and I feel like it's kind of like me describing what it is to be gay to straight people.
I mean, I do think there's a way, and in the sense that when we first started talking about like what we could potentially talk about today, one of the things that I said was that I think that non-leather people, and for that matter, I'm going to say even non-gay people, could learn a lot from sort of the mechanics of a leather scene. You know what I
Mm.
mean? Because I think that the things that are there to make that happen are things that really everyone could use more of. So
Yes.
when I say that, I mean negotiation, clear communication, boundaries, you know, understanding each other, making the attempt to understand each other a little bit.
Right.
Right? Like um, checking in,
Mm-hmm.
aftercare. All these things that sort of like to me, these are all things that like seem like, yeah, of course. You know, if you're doing anything
Yes.
with a partner, these are all things that should be on your mind. But again, it's the difference between with the 30-second toothbrush.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I wonder whether, you know, going back to what you're just saying, um, this need for like direct communication and boundaries and so forth, um, the type of people that seek those out, right? I mean, for me, I would assume everyone wants that. And
That's
I
what
don't
I
know
would
if that's
think, but
necessarily the case. I don't know if that's I don't know if that's the case.
but I would think that I have a lot of straight friends who, if you said, "Hey, can you incorporate these things into your play or sex life or whatever it is," that they would be like, "That sounds incredible." Right? Like you don't even have
Yeah.
to be kinky for that to be, "Oh yeah, that makes sense."
Yes. 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 And so that's yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like the people that I have had uh long sexual relationships with are people that are very clear in their communication style and very direct, but also have a sense of curiosity. I feel
Mm,
like um, sex can become very boring. I mean, for the lack of a better word, it can become very predictable.
sure.
And I think that one thing that the leather world offers is it offers basically a judgment-free zone in which you can explore uh, different sensory experiences uh, and basically have way more variety than I think outside of that community.
So I'd say like then I would add three more words to that list, right? Which are the three words that I think are the best words, again, in any scenario: curiosity, trust, intimacy.
Mm,
And I think like that is essentially what I honestly like. I think in a lot of leather play, like that sense of intimacy and trust is so baked into it that it's
Yes.
also it's part of the endorphin. It's part, you know what I mean?
Yes.
It's part of it for sure.
Yes. Yes. And I definitely feel like for me, one thing that I feel like I'm often working through are just like trust issues. Like I just, you know, have a hard time trusting people. And I feel like being in the leather community and having really intense sessions has only helped me start gaining trust again. But it definitely connects back
Right.
to, again, like for me, everything connects back to childhood stuff. And I really don't
Yeah.
believe people who are like, oh, childhood doesn't really affect anything. And I'm like, well, maybe you haven't done your work
Right.
on analyze yourself, like, but it does.
Right. Right.
So I hate to break it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's, you know, that's where our psyches come from. And I think it's dishonest. It's intellectually dishonest and just dishonest in general to think that your sexual psyche somehow is completely separate from the rest of your psyche, right?
Right.
So all of the things that have affected me, you know, throughout my life, whatever, you know, childhood abuse I suffered, whatever weird thing happened to me in school, whatever, you know, whatever baggage I'm carrying with me seeps its way into every
Yes.
part of my psyche. It's just the way it is. And that doesn't make you, this is the other thing, like, we as queer people should be finished with the idea of pathologizing ourselves. It's
Mm-hmm.
so crucial that we not think of these things as that as somehow like this makes us fucked up or wrong or
Yeah.
like right, it's like no, we're literally just living the human experience. And you know, we're given the brains that we're given the experiences that we've had. Our body is trying to make sense of it. Our brain is trying
Exactly.
to make sense of it, and we occasionally express ourselves in different ways as a way to process.
Yes. So I'm gonna say something like kind of controversial,
Okay.
but without too stretch for me.
Uh-oh.
But
Signing
so
off. See ya. No.
so let me say this. I've been really struggling with basically like how we diagnose people with like various conditions,
Hmm.
whether it be you know, someone has borderline personality disorder or someone is autistic and so forth, because it's similar to like how straight is the dominant and anything else is like not straight. Essentially, like when you look at the DSM and you look at how the psych community looks at these conditions, it's always from the point of view of like a normal person, but like that doesn't really exist.
Right.
And I think that there's always this like perception of like these different neurologies or you know, ways that we may be neurodiverse. I feel like we're always concerned about the deficits that they present and the difficulties, and it's
Mhm.
not necessarily recognizing that, well, maybe the normal brain also has deficiencies. Maybe they also have deficits, but it's always from like, here's a
Right.
reference point, and let me, you know, make a criticism from that reference point.
But
And
also, you should say the deficits that you're talking about, or the seeming or the perceived difficulties that they're talking about, are based on the, the quote unquote norm,
yes,
right? The deviation
yes,
from the norm.
yes,
And so that normalizes certain difficulties that the norm has, right? While sort of othering these other difficulties. And because they're the people who are doing that don't have the pure experience of the people that they're diagnosing,
exactly.
they see it as more difficult and like horrible and to be
Yeah,
avoided. Whereas the people who are experiencing it are probably, you know, I'm not saying that they're having an easy go, but they're experiencing it in a different way.
Yes.
And and so it's sort of like the way we talk about gay struggle versus, sort of non-gay struggle. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, yes, are there issues with being queer in this world that create difficulties and struggles for me that I wouldn't have otherwise? Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But does that mean that I'm not thriving under these conditions?
Totally.
Does that mean it's impossible to thrive under these conditions?
Yes.
Absolutely not. And a lot of it is the perception. It's what you pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
So I could sit around and pay attention to the idea that, well, fuck, like, I'll never have a kid of my own or something like that. That's not a real thing that I ever think, but let's just
I
say that
love.
that was one of my things.
Also, I love your straight voice. I love how you're like, fuck, and they never have. You're like going into like a Jersey accent.
Right. Well, that I'm thinking of people who want kids. I don't.
Yeah.
but I could create that struggle in my brain, or I could say, wow, I have this like situation where I don't have anyone depending on me, and how can I make that work for me?
Yes. Yes.
Right? So it's always going to be about that perception. It's not about the actual difficulty itself.
And I think that it's important to recognize that perception because I think, you know, again, going back to being a kid, the perception that my mother had of gay people were that they were perverts, they were deviants, and if I was going to be gay, I was going to die of AIDS.
Right.
Like that's literally what I
Same.
was, told.
Yeah, same.
So, and I feel like I would never take away my gayness, like the freedom that I have as a gay man, I clearly recognize. And sure, that may be the case here in America, that if I was in Russia or some other
Right.
place would not be the case. However, I'm not living all those lives. I'm here in America, and it is afforded me a way out of like the heteronormativity that I think is a cage that so many straight people put themselves in and don't even realize it.
For me, the thing that I would never trade in, and I would never trade it in. If somebody said I could do this all over as a straight person, I'd be like, no, not interested.
No.
And but one of the things that I feel the most strongly about is how much my experience um, gave me a deep sense of empathy and care for people who are struggling, and
Mm.
also people in general. I mean, I honestly feel like this is where every part of me that I think people value, my ability to listen, or my ability to sort of intuit things, or my ability to give advice, or my ability to just be there for a person, just hold space for them and understand who they, what that they're going through something, whether or not I can fully grasp what they're going through.
Hmm.
All those things, which I think are gifts, um, I believe are directly descendant from my experience as a gay man.
Yeah.
And I would never trade that in because it's literally who I am.
Do you think, at least my theory on this is that, I certainly identify with all those things that you just listed. And I often think that's because as gay men, we we get to know ourselves on a deeper level at a much younger age than I think other groups do. And because of that, we become more intuitive because we have felt those things in ourselves that then we can sense it in other people.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've gone through the, canonical like Dark Nights of the Soul type of thing. And we can recognize that in other people because we started out life for many of us going through that. Like I
Mm-hmm.
have I recognized that I was gay the first day of my kindergarten class. Like I knew I was not like all the other boys. And that really started like that day like kicked off this like whole internal monologue in my head of like why are you different? Like
Right.
what is going on here? You know, why are these boys so annoying?
I
Like
always
why
talk
do I
about
not want to be?
my
Yeah.
second grade teacher that I think I've told you about. My second grade teacher, I would say he was the person that was probably the moment that, even though I didn't have the word for it, that was the being in his class. So my second grade teacher, I'll just, again, I've told you this, but for people who don't
Yeah.
eavesdrop on our conversations, my second grade teacher was an amazing man, uh, and if you saw a picture of him today, you would be like, oh, he's clearly going to Fire Island this weekend. He was very gay man in the 70s, early 80s, right?
Mm,
And the mustache and sort of like the free flowing hair, and just,
yes.
he was very, yeah, very, very of the time. And um, I remember being in his class. I remember really feeling a strong affinity for him. And I
Mm,
remember feeling very strongly that this was my person, that
mm,
whatever he is, I am too. And there was nothing remote, like, there wasn't even anything culturally gay about him other than how he looked, maybe. It wasn't like he was
hmm.
like schooling us on Donna Summer or anything, like, right? Like,
Imagine.
he was just a plain old teacher. But that's what I mean when I talk about that sort of like ability to self-identify and see it in other people.
Mm,
When you are something, people who share that can see it too and
yes.
call it out in you. And
Yes.
I realized that even at 7 years old, I saw it in him, I identified it in him, and I
Yep.
realized that that's what I was. And that's
I
fucking profound, honestly.
yes. Yes. And isn't it amazing that you were able to have that experience at the age of 7? Because think about so many kids who would benefit from having a similar experience, but unfortunately they were being raised in perhaps a small town that had no gay teachers and they had no, you know, possibility to know that this was like another way to exist
Right,
in this world.
right. And it definitely, he put me, just seeing him and sort of like having that year with him, it put me in a place where I definitely did feel less alone, even though I understood that, e- even though what I understood wasn't clear to me yet.
Hmm.
Like, I knew what being gay meant, and I knew that I liked boys. I'd probably known that I liked boys forever. But
Hmm.
that experience with him sort of crystallized all those things into one sort of cohesive idea of, oh, like, this is actually like a way of being.
Yes.
Which, yeah, I mean, eventually you sort of, and again, like, that didn't necessarily help me come out when I was 12 either, right? I still I still had to deal with all the self-hatred and everything
Of
that I'd learned at
course.
home, right?
Right.
Um,
And the media and because at that time like it's all about AIDS and
AIDS and Jerry
yeah.
Falwell and
Yes.
fucking, everything. Yeah. I mean, so it was like that was completely a huge part in why I stayed hidden for so long. But I think
Mhm.
that it's definitely a huge part of my awakening story, and I always think of him, and unfortunately, and I've said this to you, but I have a hunch anyway that I was able to find his obituary, and he
Uh,
had died not too long after um, I was in his class,
oh,
and he was young and he was gay,
yeah.
and the obituary, you know, he didn't have any, he didn't have a wife and children, we'll say that, And um, I do believe the obituary said that he died of cancer, but that was very common in the early 80s.
Yes.
So who
Yeah.
knows?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, what's coming to my head is just about this practice of straight washing where, for instance, here, uh, this man's life that he lived potentially is not being presented in an honest way in his obituary because those that wrote the obituary may feel uncomfortable with talking about gay life and so forth. And I feel like it's really important going back to previous things that we said about like maintaining our own history and being honest about it. Because if we put it at the hands of straight people, they really don't know. They really don't know
Right,
what it is to live as a gay person. Like,
right.
as much as they may be allies, and I think that allies are important, it's also to recognize when they don't know uh, the full experience.
When they're out of their depth, which is
Yeah.
something that like even as like, as trans allies, I try to step the fuck back, right? Like I do what I can to sort of promote that inclusivity and sort of like talk about the amazing trans people in our community and in history. But there's a point where you have to step back, where I'm out of my depth
Right.
because I don't fully understand the experience. And I think that the people who are living it should be, they should be the
Yes.
ones that their experiences are centered and, you know, um, and listened to.
Totally.
So how did this come out, by the way?
Oh, so wow. Maybe I can show you that. So they are nice and like a golden brown.
They
I
look
will make this for you if
delicious.
you decide to visit in September. And yeah, I mean they're very buttery if you're into butter. They're very buttery. That's what makes them golden. And yeah, I'm
So is
very
that
into it.
sort of like a coconut macaron or
Yeah,
like
yeah, you
sort of?
could think about it as like
Yeah.
a Swedish coconut macaron.
Okay.
Um, so I'm a big fan of that. And then um, I ended up also making something vegan, which I made a salad with black beans and kidney beans and barley,
Wow.
and dressed that up with some olive oil and some apple cider vinegar. So um,
So
I have a
tell
whole
me the
meal for
dark,
you.
tell me the dark secret of the leather cook. Do you actually just bring like Tupperwares full of food to all your neighbors? Because there's no way you can eat that all.
I mean, this certainly, right? Like this
That's
is a pretty healthy meal. And
yeah.
this, so what I do during the weekends is I make a lot of food so that during the week I, may feel more exhausted because of work. So I try to always have like leftovers and things like this. So this is going to be
Okay.
my lunch for a few days. Probably will get me through Wednesday.
Okay.
And then when it comes to like these desserts, well, I probably will give a
You'll
few.
probably eat them all
I,
tonight.
yeah, I will have another one today, and I'm very good about limiting myself of exercising control when it comes to
All
this,
right.
and so I typically will limit myself to like one or two a day, and then give a few pieces to friends, and um, yeah, I give a lot of my desserts, like usually half of my desserts I will give to people. Like last week I have like a fishmonger at the farmer's market, and I gave her these like I put it on my Instagram, these like fudge and chocolate balls. And so I gave them to her. I gave her a few, and today she told me that she really loved them and that she thought it was so sweet that I gave her some chocolate balls. So I thought that was nice.
I mean, yeah, like you've clearly got the food to spare. Every time I see you cooking, I'm like, how in the world? What is he doing with all this food?
Yeah, usually on like a Sunday or Monday, like my fridge is usually like packed full of meals, and then I'm kind of just like surviving in some ways for the rest of the week because I'm like, I am so tired. I don't feel like, cooking that, intensively.
This is actually the part where I feel like, so there's the question of are you leather enough, right? I don't have a problem with that question. But are you a cook enough? I'm not a cook. I'm
Yeah.
so bad. So I
So,
feel like this is the part of where I'm posing.
well,
I'm a total poser.
I would say I struggle with that, because I am not, I'm totally self-taught. I've taken zero cooking classes. I mean, since like the sixth grade was like my only
Right.
cooking class. Um, but I feel like cooking should be available to the masses. I feel like you shouldn't have to have a degree in it. You should be able to open up a book and cook. And so I try to present recipes and do things that I feel like should be accessible to everyone. And when people ask me like really cooking chemistry questions, I'm kind of like, do you really care about that? Like, is that really interesting? Because let me tell you, I'm bored by the question. Like, I'm just not
But it's like
interested.
it's like me as a musician, right? I'm completely self-taught. I've never I just picked up a guitar one day and was like, I'm gonna keep moving my fingers until it sounds good or
Yeah,
right or right enough.
yeah, yeah.
And I've kind of just kept going and kept going. And when people want to talk to me about anything guitar related, like literally anything, like chords or technique or equipment, gear, like
Mm.
whatever, like I'm just like, I don't really care. Like if it sounds good, that's all I care about.
I um I am so glad that you're saying this because that's exactly how I feel about cooking. Like I get asked sometimes about like really nitty-gritty details about food, and I'm like, I don't know and I don't care. Like let's talk about sex, but I don't want to talk about this. Like this is boring to me. So I it's probably, something that I'll probably need to like work on if I'm going to, I don't know, like do this. But
I mean, if we're ever gonna get a leather cookbook,
well, that is one thing that I've been like thinking. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And this earlier this year, I was like, you know what? Maybe I should be doing a self-publishing route for the cookbook because like like I'm trained as a mathematician, so as a mathematician, we have to learn this software called LaTeX or LaTeX. Uh, that basically, like, I wrote a cookbook in 2015 using this, like, and it looks pretty nice.
okay.
And so I'm like, I already have like the technology down, and what I'm going to do is just like what I'm thinking is like take basically recipes that I put on my Instagram and write them up in a book, but I want it to be a little bit more me. So I'm thinking that like how I've been trying to decide is like chapters. Like I'm thinking that I might have a section about Sweden and that maybe I'll open that up with like an essay about Sweden and exploring the leather side of Sweden and
Mm.
then showing people food and again like having it be like a full as much of like a full sensory experience in a book that you can have.
Right.
But yeah, so I'm thinking that I might, like, for many years I was like, no, I'm gonna get a publisher, I'm gonna get an agent, blah blah blah. I mean, if that came my way, great. The thing is, it's like I, I don't want to deal with like a straight agent who wants to minimize uh my presence or minimize the gayness. Like, if anything, my book is
I
gonna
think
be like,
you're you're underestimating how much people are just like, he's got a big social following. They would never minimize you.
yeah. Well, I mean, minimized by like being less gay. Like, I want basically like a cookbook that's verging on pornography. Like that, and I'm like, maybe I just have to do this. Like, maybe I just have to do this myself.
I mean, with that description, I don't know that I want it. No.
No, I think everyone wants it. Like,
I'm
everyone wants
scared.
it.
You're testing my sense of self. Um, no, but I mean, I do think I like the idea because I know that you think of food geographically, and there's a lot of that shows in your feed,
Mm,
and a lot of your cookbooks are geographic
yeah,
as opposed to like, other types of cookbooks or whatever. So it's like I think that that's like smart and learning something about the leather scenes in these different places also I think is really cool.
yeah,
I think there's a market for this.
there
And I think
is.
there's actually,
Uh,
I'm sure there's a queer publisher who wants all of your queer self to
yes,
do that.
yes. So, if I happen to be able to make connections with a queer publisher, that would be great. That's where I am at the moment, is trying to think about that, because I feel like I have so much material at the moment on my Instagram that to be able to boil that down into a book would be amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm here for it.
Well, I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation. Can you believe that we've been talking for 2 hours now?
Kind of. We
Well,
do that.
yeah, I feel like 2 hours is like our normal
Pretty
2 to 4 hours.
much.
I don't know if everyone else can handle that, but
I actually just did a podcast that was over 3 hours,
wow.
and a lot of people DM'd me to say they listened to all of it. And I was like, wow, okay, cool.
I mean,
So
I don't know about you, but I'm always listening to podcasts. Like, if I'm not on the phone talking to someone, I always have my headphones on and I'm listening to just people talk.
interesting.
Uh,
I'm definitely more of a reader, but I
mm,
like
for
to read.
me, I can only read in the morning. Like, when I first wake up, I will read and I'll read for about an hour. But if I try to read in the afternoon or in the evening, typically, like, I'll just fall asleep. Like, I'm not going to retain anything. So it has to be like right when I wake up.
But
And
I have
then,
books for that too. I have books where it's like it's cool if I fall asleep.
yes, yes, yes.
Almost books where you're
The
supposed to fall
the
asleep.
point is, yes.
Yeah.
I earlier this year, I don't know if you've ever tried to read Infinite Jest,
Oh God,
but
no.
I don't know why. I started out this year like, I'm gonna read this book. I'm gonna do this. And I got through like the first like 150 pages. And I was like, like and out of the 150 pages, there was like one page I actually liked. And the rest of it, I was just like, this is like, I'm just not getting anything out of it. So I stopped reading it. But it is like one of the books that I'll read if I really want to fall asleep.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
yeah,
150 pages though is a valiant effort. I'll give you that.
it is. I mean, I'm still determined to read it just to say like I read it. But yeah, it's not as fun.
I mean, did you do War and Peace?
I have. I
Okay.
have, and I do like War and Peace. I do like Anna Karenina. Like, Anna Karenina is like my one of my favorite books. But yeah, I've read all of Tolstoy. Like,
Okay.
I've done all of them. I've done all the Bronte sisters. Like, I've done I've done all that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's dense academic books at night. That's the way to go. Or just the ones and the other thing about academic books is like it's cheap paper and the type is always weird and it just makes you drowsy. It's like
Mm.
designed to make you drowsy. You have
What
that
is
academic thing, so it's like you'll understand.
what book are you reading at the moment? Maybe not for sleeping, but just in general. What are you reading?
So I'm reading like a couple of books. Like I have if you see at my nightstand, I have
Yeah,
probably like 10 books on it. Um, I'm gonna get this one book though, because
sure.
this book, uh, Our Migrant Souls by
Hmm.
Hector Tobar, a
Okay.
meditation on race and the meanings and myths of Latino. It's
Interesting.
it's something that I've been really thinking about a lot lately because Latino is such a weird term that means a million things and nothing as far
Mm.
as I'm concerned. Because Latin America is not a monolithic place at
Sure.
all. And so Latino is just this category that's been invented for the rest of the world, I guess, like to sort of make sense of us. And then we struggle with what that means for our own sort of individual identities.
I see.
Um, and so it's one of the things where it's like I sort of relate it to queerness in the way of like there's this, rainbow of, types of queers and different sexual identities and gender identities and all these things that for political purposes and for historical purposes too, because our socio-historic moment is very intertwined.
Mm.
We sort of need to have that cohesion. um, but I guess we're getting to a place I think in history where Latin folks are starting to be like, okay, but have we lost something too? And
Mm.
what does this really mean to be Latin, Latino, Latinx, whatever you want to say?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, we talk about Latinidad, this
Okay.
weird notion of, which is almost like a weird word that implies that there's some sort of monolithic culture. But
Mm.
know, all Latin cultures don't even speak the same language, right? Like we, it's like, I mean, there's hundreds of indigenous cultures that have nothing to do with each other, right? So
Yes.
it's like, so how do we maintain a sense of sort of cohesion? I think for the sake of, at least in America, there's a political advantage to having that cohesion, but you know, culturally and sort of individually, is there a benefit to that?
Mm.
And so that's sort of like the question that I think a lot of people are getting at. Um, yeah. Anyway,
Interesting. Yeah.
so I think about these things a lot because I think about them in terms of queerness too, and I think about like that sense of like the benefits of sort of being together. But I think the Latino moment is very different than the queer moment right now.
Mm.
And I
Hmm.
think there is sort of an importance now in understanding our individual histories and cultures and celebrating that as well without necessarily divorcing ourselves from the entirety of Latin America.
Mm. Yeah. That's interesting. Mm. Well, I am reading at the moment. I happen to have the book right here. So I'm reading this book called My Cat Yugoslavia.
Okay, I don't know it.
And this, I think it came out last year, maybe. Um, but it's interesting because actually it came out 6 years ago. Um, it's basically two stories in this book. One story takes place in the 1950s in Kosovo and centers around like a female protagonist. And I've only gotten through a third of it, but it's around basically like an arranged marriage and how she essentially becomes property of her husband. And it's making me think all about like generational trauma and how, like in the book, she talks about a lot of things that are happening to her that she didn't feel comfortable with. But because that was the norm to experience this, she just tells herself that this is okay.
Right.
It is okay for this. And then obviously, like that feeling of discomfort, it, it doesn't like just disappear, right? Like, more research that we do, we see like, well, chronic illnesses can sometimes come from such a thing, or, you know, your parents may be traumatized, but they don't want to recognize it, and then they bring it onto you and
Right.
so forth. So the other narrator that the book follows is her son, who, you it's in the 2000s, and he's living in Finland. So there's some like escape from Kosovo to Finland, but he's also gay. And so I think that there's a lot of conflict in the book about like dealing with cultural expectations, because the gay son does not want to abide by the expectations of his parents, um, but also his mom didn't want to abide by her expectations, but she kind of just did it anyway because that's what people do. And it just makes me like, it's bringing up emotions of just like, feel like a lot of people just go through life going through these stages because that's what people do, and they don't really ask themselves the hard question of like, is this what I want? Like, am I willing to take control of my life and do the thing that I want to do?
Right. I mean, the real question, right, is like, must I endure this?
Yeah,
Sometimes, sadly, the answer is yes. I think there are situations where, like when you described that earlier, it sort of like brought me back to that the vision of being restrained and
yeah,
that feeling of like, fuck, what do I do? Right? Like
yeah,
sometimes nothing. Sometimes you have to change your internal perception to sort of temporarily escape that.
yeah.
But it's still a lack of choice. There's still a lack of choice involved. So
Yes. And I think, I mean, not to like go so psychological, but I think a lot of the relationships that I put myself in my youth and like in my 20s was a form of that. I think it was a form of like emotional bondage, or like, just a restraint in some capacity, and like testing myself because I feel like, well, that's all I knew, right? As a kid,
yeah,
was to exist in this space in which I had to like sacrifice myself and, kind of recommitting this like crime against my body, or like a crime against my drive. Um, I mean, it was just like that was my whole 20s.
well, this is where
And
we could circle back to the beginning of the conversation,
yes,
which is that ultimately this is partially where our weird assertion for control comes from.
totally. Yes.
And so here we are. But it's I mean, again, I don't want to pathologize it. It
Yeah. I,
it's
I mean,
just
it is. It is just the human experience. It's the condition. And I feel like, I think there's power in recognizing one's behaviors and one's patterns,
mhm.
and being very aware of those, and checking in with yourself to say, is this really in alignment with my values? Like, is this really what I want? Or do I want something else? And allowing you to like question things, allowing you to take space for that examination. I think that's where the power lays, and just recognizing that you have that control.
Being deliberate.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, that's a concise way of saying it.
Yeah. All right, now that we just killed another half hour.
I know.
You can just call me after this if you
I
want.
know. Um, so Norman, as we close this off, uh, one, are there any like closing remarks or things that you want people to hear from you that you haven't been able to communicate or hasn't come up? And two, um, how do you want or how could people get to know you better if they so choose to?
Um, I feel like we covered a lot, so
Yes.
I don't know that I have anything much more to add without tacking on another half hour to
Sure.
the conversation. But um, yeah, I am at Norman Brannon pretty much everywhere, Instagram and Twitter and Threads, uh,
And
and
Blue Sky.
and I am on Blue Sky, but I have sort of stopped. Blue Sky got really, it just feels like Grinder. And I was kind of like, okay, this is maybe a little too much for me right now.
So you're not into the whole like Twitter porn thing.
No, it's never,
Yeah.
yeah. It's too much. It's like I don't like having any agency over what comes up on my phone when I open an app. So that's how Blue Sky was feeling. I was like, okay, shit.
So you're not into glory holes, is what you're saying.
I'm actually not. No.
Okay.
I like to know. And so, yeah, so at Norman Brannon everywhere. I also, if you're into punk or hardcore music, I am publishing a newsletter at antimatter.substack.com. And, that's a place where it's pretty much just a lot of essay and conversations with different folks. Um, and if you like my styles of conversation with the leather cook, then maybe that would be something you'd be interested in over there.
Great. Um, so thank you so much for everyone who has joined us throughout this conversation. My plan is to post this onto Instagram, and then I will take the audio and put it on Spotify as well, because perhaps because this is a long conversation, it's a little bit easier to digest over Spotify. So that is the plan. If you watching this or listening to this, if you happen to be interested in having a conversation with me over live, feel free to reach out and we can go from there. Uh, anyway, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Norman, for
Thank you.
joining. And I hope you all have a great day. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.